Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. When you're ready to build your next pipeline or want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends at Linode. With their new managed database service, you can launch a production-ready MySQL, Postgres, or MongoDB cluster in minutes, with automated backups, 40 gigabit connections from your application hosts, and high-throughput SSDs. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today and get a $100 credit to launch a database, create a Kubernetes cluster, or take advantage of all of their other services. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Data teams are increasingly under pressure to deliver. According to a recent survey by Ascend.io, 95% reported being at or over capacity, with 72% of data experts reporting demands on their team going up faster than they can hire. It's no surprise they are increasingly turning to automation. In fact, while only 3.5% report having current investments in automation, 85% of data teams plan on investing in automation in the next 12 months. That's where our friends at Ascend.io come in. The Ascend Data Automation Cloud provides a unified platform for data ingestion, transformation, orchestration, and observability. Ascend users love its declarative pipelines, powerful SDK, elegant UI, and extensible plugin architecture, as well as its support for Python, SQL, Scala, and Java. Ascend automates workloads on Snowflake, Databricks, BigQuery, and open source Spark, and can be deployed in AWS, Azure, or GCP. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/ascend and sign up for a free trial. If you're a Data Engineering Podcast listener, you get credits worth $5,000 when you become a customer. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Tommy Ioanoulis about using data to improve efficiencies in multi-location service businesses with Ops Analytica. So, Tommy, can you start by introducing yourself?
Thank you, Tobias, and thank you for having me on today. My name's Tommy Ioanoulis. I am one of the co-founders of Ops Analytica, which stands for Operations Analytics. And like many of the founders that you have on your show, I have a hotel, restaurant, and stand-up comedy background. Actually, I got into tech as part of an operations job in the restaurant industry where my bosses came to me and were like, hey, man, we need to start reporting on all these audits we're doing out in the field. And an audit, for those of you who might not know, is when, either a third party or a representative of a company will go out and just basically inspect a location to make sure that it's clean and it's operating the way it's supposed to, kind of a brand protection thing. And they do those usually quarterly, sometimes monthly, if a location's having some issues. This is back in 2008, right? Their idea is that me and my assistant would just hand enter 5,000 audits a month into an Excel so we could report on it. And I was at Quiznos at the time. And for those of you who don't know, Quiznos was one of the largest subchains in the country, in 2008, 2009. It's also got the infamous reputation of being one of the largest franchise system implosions ever, meaning that basically all those stores went out of business and they went from over 5,000 locations to about 350. At the time, we had about 5,000. And we were auditing constantly because we were closing stores because people weren't making money. And so they wanted to get the field guys in the stores as often as possible to see that they were clean and operating well, but also to kind of gauge their business health so they could kind of predict who might be closing next, if that makes sense. And so that's kind of how I got into tech. Is I tried to buy a solution, couldn't get one, went to IT, and IT did what they do best. No offense, Tobias. They said, no, you can't have this. We don't have the resources. And I'm like, what else if I built it myself? And they were like, no, not secure. IT is I think when you get an IT degree, you have a whole class on different ways to say no. Here's the 50 reasons why you can say no to this. And so anyways, finally my boss is like, I don't care what they say. What is this going to cost me? And it was really cheap because I ended up using a platform called FormRouter, which I don't know if they're still around, but it was kind of an early SaaS business where you could subscribe, at that time frame, think about 2008, 2009, build your own form and then download the data from their servers onto your own database. And so when he found out it was gonna be $2,500, he's like, I'll just put it on my corporate card, just build this thing because we're getting yelled at by the CEO and the COO. So who cares what the IT says? And that's how I kind of got my foray into tech. And now I have a company called Ops Analytica, which is basically we help multi-location businesses and large high volume businesses manage their teams and measure what their teams are doing from a sort of an operations perspective. So making sure that we're controlling what we can control, making sure we're safe, we're clean, we're ready for guests, or customers or patients or whatever, right?
In terms of the types of information that you're working with at Ops Analytica, I'm interested in understanding kind of the sources of data that you're dealing with, the form that data takes. Like, are you dealing with, form entries where people at those different locations are prompted with, some input and they just have to fill out a form? Is it sensor-based IoT data? Are you dealing with, imagery? Just curious kind of the variety and scale of information that you're working with.
We have sort of 3 sources of data right now, and we hope to expand that into the future, right? First off, what we're doing, because we're managing the team, right? So what I care about, so you think about a restaurant or a retail or even a doctor's office, whatever it might be, they've got a system, let's just do a restaurant to keep it simple. Everybody eats at restaurants. We're all familiar with them, so it's an easy use case. At a restaurant, they've got a POS system, and the POS system is how they manage the transactional sale thing, and it's also how they track sales mix of products and whatnot like that. And it provides a workflow for capturing sales information, transacting the transaction, whether it be credit card or money, and then telling the people in the back, hey, go make this food, right? So that kind of stuff's handled. I'm more focused on, was the restaurant clean? Did we taste the food? Did we stock the line correctly? Did we make sure the food was safe? I focus more on those human activities that have typically been in this gigantic black hole where nobody could see them because you couldn't track what humans were doing, right? And so a lot of the history of these big multi-location chains has been backing into what's happening operationally by looking at some other indicators like sales and profits and costs and all that. So I'm getting to your actual answer. The primary answer is, I would say 90% of our data today comes in from forms filled out on a schedule, checklists on a schedule by employees, right? And we put them on these schedule windows so that they get done when they're operationally significant for the business. Within those forms, we can capture truth bulls. I mean, you have a more technical audience. So we're getting bulls, we're getting decimals, we can get free text, but free text is tough, obviously, because for instance, we have free text where you can just write in an answer, or we have what we call multiple choice text where they have to select a button, but then the button has a value, which is text, but at least it's formatted. It's always the same options, if you will, which makes that a lot easier for reporting, right? Because reporting on free text is garbage, just impossible to do it well, at least. And then we can capture dates, times, and we also capture a lot of photos too. But we don't do any analysis on the photos today. We really are just capturing the photo for human analysis and validation of what's happening. We also we can monitor source on decimals specifically. So we do integrate with digital thermometers. So the idea being that you can have a Bluetooth thermometer, and as you walk up to temp something, you simply tap into the number box. If your digital thermometer is connected, you see a live temperature feed coming off the thermometer, and then you insert the thermometer into the food, let it register, and then you push a button, and that button then inserts the temperature into our checklist. So we do track that source data, where it's coming from. And then one other thing is, you mentioned IoT sensors. So you'll be the first I'll be mentioning on the show. We should be releasing that IoT next week. We have partnered with Cooper Atkins, which is a large thermometer and IoT company, and we will be displaying their IoT sensor data in our platform. And there's so much I want to do with sensors. It's not even funny. And we can get into that because we implemented the Sensor Things API. So we were starting with this Cooper Atkins integration, but we implemented the Sensor Things API standard so that we can in the future take on more sensor data and have a way of getting structured data from other entities into the system so we can analyze it and display it for our customers. So Most of it's coming in through the forms. We do control the source of the forms on certain questions, like the thermometer questions, and then we will have sensor data coming in as well.
And so in terms of the types of questions and insights that business owners are looking to be able to get answers to and understanding of for their operations, what are the different pieces of information that they're trying to extract from this raw data that you're collecting, whether that's at the CEO level of a large franchise organization or the individual location managers who need to understand how their employees are performing against the corporate standards, and the types of questions and answers that you're looking to provide?
That's a great question. And it's interesting because this software, this type of software, I'm not going to say the technology, I wouldn't say this is just all new for these businesses, right? Because what happened is, if you think about it, like if you go back to that Ray Kroc movie, that McDonald's movie, McDonald's was really the launch of the big, large multi-location chain. I mean, you had Howard Johnson's, you had Hot Shops out of Marriott, but McDonald's was truly the first super systems integrated restaurant chain, right? But they all started in the 50s and 60s. And so, the technology just didn't exist to do what we do today when it comes to capturing this data, right? So historically, what happened was the restaurant industry and a lot of these big multi-location industries that kind of ran on their heels, national retailers and everything else, hotel chains, they never had access to getting real-time operations data. And so they morphed their businesses to be a more training-focused, systems-focused, but paper systems. And they just focused on training because they knew they could control that. And they focused on paper systems. But the problem, obviously, with paper systems is there's no visibility, there's no accountability. All the data just gets lost on the paper. No one does them. I mean, the big joke in the restaurant industry is that, all the checklists are pencil whipped when they're on paper, that type of thing. That's been prevalent all the way to today. My biggest competitor is still paper. So when we talk about the checklist that we're creating, this is still the first generation of people that are digitizing checklists and procedures and moving them off of paper into digital, right? Whereas if you think about the POS system, as an example, the register, that started in the late 70s, early 80s. That's been through multiple iterations. And so now you're getting more, Toast is a Boston company, right? You're getting more and more, you're on the third or fourth or fifth generation of this POS software, and it's just getting better and smarter and more intuitive. We're still just taking, a lot of times, these guys' paper checklists and moving them to digital. And for them, that's a gigantic leap forward, right? Because now they have visibility and accountability that they never had before, but they're not at a point where they're designing checklists for a digital world. They're still sort of just, hey, let's take these, what we call red book processes. The red book, for your listeners, was literally a red book that had all your checklists built for every month. So you would buy them a quarter in advance, and they would mail you these 3 red binders, and it would be here are your May checklists, and they'd be one for every day, So we call them red book processes. We're taking those red book processes and moving them into our platform. So that's just a little bit of a history there. The kind of questions we're getting are, from a food safety perspective, we're temping a lot of food, right? So temping salsa, temping ranch dressing, temping meat, temping coolers. In restaurants, poor temperature control is the number one cause of foodborne illness, right? Keeping cold things cold, hot things hot. Basically, you don't want anything between 41 and 135, 140. That's considered the temperature danger zone. So if you ever get served food in a restaurant and it's lukewarm, that's bad, because that means that food's like a warm, moist Petri dish that if there was foodborne illness, germs, bacteria in there, they could be growing at a really fast rate in that temperature danger zone. You kind of want it above 135 is where you start killing things. And then depending on the certain bacteria, it goes up to 165 is where you need to get the food temperature. So lukewarm food is just generally bad across the board, right? We're getting a lot of operational questions too. Just as important as food safety is cleanliness, appearance of the restaurant. Those are also big things. Appearance of bathrooms, cleanliness of bathrooms, those are huge. So we're tracking a lot of that. We're also tracking a lot of what I would call prep or stock in the respect of not inventory, but like, if you're thinking about going through a Starbucks drive-through or a McDonald's drive-through or something for breakfast, or Dunkin' because of the part of the country you guys are in, like, when you see that drive-through line, like how many times have you been driving? I could just use an egg McMuffin and a hash brown and a coffee. And as you're driving, you come up on your McDonald's and then you look at the drive-through line and it's like longer than normal. Like maybe there's 4 or 5 extra cars in there. And mentally, as you're driving, you calculate, I don't have time for that. Like if it had been in a normal spot for that line, then I would go in. But because the line's way back, I just got to keep going and I go without type of thing. That's generally tied to speed of service, and that's generally tied to either staffing or stocking, right? If you're in the middle of cooking egg McMuffins and there's no eggs on the line and you have to run to the walk-in to go get eggs, that slows everybody down, you know what I mean, a couple of minutes. So it's those kinds of things, making sure that they are properly prepped for the shift. So those are the kind of operational things like on a daily basis that we're capturing at these stores. Now, then you expand out to audits. When you do an audit, once again, that's an inspection of the whole store. So they're looking at menu boards. They're looking at the shape of the seats in the booths, the cleanliness of the restaurant, the floors. They're doing the entire scope of the building. So that would be an audit. But then, what's interesting about our platform is because we're one of the most advanced platforms in our space in this area, we get people doing a lot of other stuff. It just truly becomes an operations management tool. So yeah, we're doing those red book processes, those daily things. We're also we're putting in processes in place for their cash outs and their deposits and labor laws and what we call LTOs or limited time offers, marketing events where you're going to see a lot of ads running like in the world. They need to check that people have like learned how to make that food, what their signage is. You want to see table tents and window clings and menu boards are correct and register programming is correct. So we kind of run the gamut of everything. Also, a lot of compliance stuff too. Like you got 14-year-olds working. Do they have work permits? In certain markets, schedules have to be posted 2 weeks in advance. And if you change them, you have to pay a fine and pay the employee. And like Seattle and some of the more liberal cities have done these very strict scheduling rules. And so they have to make sure, the companies have to make sure that they're not violating those or they'll get fined. You know what I mean? So we kind of run the gamut of daily operations.
To that point of what you were saying about you being one of the more advanced options in the space, and you also mentioned platforms such as Toast that are the point of sale systems that a lot of these franchises have oriented around. And I'm sure that provides some information to the site managers and the business at an aggregate level. I'm wondering if you can just give a bit of a sense of what the kind of competitive landscape looks like in this area of working with service businesses, particularly if you're dealing with multiple locations, even if it's just 2, and just some of the types of differentiating features that the companies in this space are looking to provide.
I think we're all startups for the most part, right? Like there isn't because this really only began late 2000s. There was one company called RisePoint. They were originally called Steaton, but they got bought by private equity. Now they're called RisePoint. And they started off doing audits, right? So this will be kind of interesting. So everyone started off as an audit platform because that was sort of the main thing that restaurants and these chains wanted to do, was make sure that their field guys could go in and audit their stores to make sure, once again, from a brand protection standpoint, that the stores were operating clean and that they were, they weren't selling random stuff. Like you weren't like a Subway selling boba tea and, weird things like that. They just make sure everything was cool, copacetic, you were following the rules and that you were safe. And audits are really great at identifying large system-wide issues. Like, hey, everybody's struggling with, question X. That's what audits are really good at doing. And then you go, okay, well, now we know everyone's struggling with question X. It's probably not that they're actually struggling with it. Maybe our procedure's bad, our equipment's bad, our training's bad. Let's try to uncover why they're all struggling with this, and then we can fix it and move on. And that's what audits are really good for. But This is a quote from one of the head of like Steritech, which is a big third-party auditing firm. She's like, we're not going to audit anybody to greatness. Like all we can do is just come in and just, tell you what's kind of happening. And their approach is to try to come in and coach, right? Hey, this is what you're doing wrong. And this is why it's not safe. Let us help you fix it type of thing. And so that started like late 2000s into the 2010s. And obviously the iPhone was a game changer, right? Because it took us off those Palm Windows smartphones, which my little first platform was made to run on, just basically a web form. And it gave us like this more dynamic environment to build web apps and mobile apps for. Like then obviously the iPad came out, whatever, after 2010 or right after that, sometime in that area. And that's really what opened the door technology-wise for platforms like ours. And it's funny because you think back, like I'm 50 now, but like you think back and you can't even remember a time where we didn't have smartphones or tablets. But literally it was like 15 years ago we didn't. You know what I mean? Like it's not even that long. But those enabled us to start doing more stuff. And so when we started our company, I was like, yeah, audits are fine, but you need to be able to change behavior at the location level. So I always came in focused on daily checklists. And the big difference between dailies and audits is that audits are sort of a singular, hard-coded, you get one audit, right? And everybody knows, especially your listeners know, doing one of anything is easier than doing two, right? And so everything's cleaner on an auditing platform because you're going to run one audit and you're going to have all your reporting as a singular reporting based off of this one audit. So the big auditing platforms, they could do a different audit for each client, but they were only doing one audit per client. Does that make sense? So then all the reporting was singular in nature. How is this audit doing over time? And blah, 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 blah. And when we came in on day one, we focused on daily checklists. And we knew we were going to go dailies because that's A, you can make more money off dailies, but B, you're going to have a better impact on the business. So we coded our platform always to be able to handle more than one checklist or audit or whatever, right? But that also adds clicks and a little bit more complexity because, you're not just dealing with one, you're dealing with two or more across the board. So the big competitive landscape in our space is you have the audit platforms and then you have the daily checklist platforms. And a lot of the audit platforms added the capability to do dailies, right? But what I have found with those guys is that they struggle because so much of the stuff was hard coded in because they started with that sort of singular audit. They've had to like really kind of retrofit and claw into their code base to try to get something to work with multiple, right? Multiple versions of a checklist, multiple checklists across the board. So in our space, we're competing against audit platforms and daily checklist platforms. And then, in reality, if you were to look at the competitive landscape, you can do this for free. You can do this with Google Sheets or a Google form or even a free SurveyMonkey if you wanted to, all the way up to that'd be one end of the spectrum, doing it like an online Excel if you wanted to. You can totally do it that way, but it's really brutal, right? Because, if you've ever tried to use a spreadsheet on a phone, you got to click into the cell and then, everything changes and it's hard to manipulate and it's hard to move around and you can't capture structured data. So that would be like the easiest, would be the cheapest, but the hardest to use. Then you can kind of graduate into sort of like a Google Forms or a SurveyMonkey world. Those are good because you can get structured data out of them. You can have data types. You can even have some follow-up questions, a little bit of logic in there. But they don't do a great job in the space because they're all on demand, right? And if you're running a busy business, you're going to forget to do things at the right times. And so just having this sort of on-demand world is okay for some stuff. But when you really need to make sure your food is safe before lunch is served, you need to get it on a schedule. And that's where those guys kind of fall down. And then I would say you have the bulk of our competitors are there in the middle, which they've got a platform that has scheduling, that has accountability, that's measuring not only the answers to the questions, but is also measuring how well the teams are doing at getting the questions done. And that would be the bulk of our competitors are in that space. And then we're kind of on the far end of the spectrum because we have all of that stuff, but we also have this rule builder, and we created our own scripting language within our platform that gives us this rule builder as our sort of secret sauce. And it allows us to create features that we can market and sell off of, and more importantly, win deals off of, that are all based on just creating interesting, logical, what we call rules in the system that allow us to make dynamic checklists and all kinds of things like that. So that's kind of the spectrum of competitors in there. And what we find is that we're not always the first guy that gets into a client, but we are a lot of advanced clients' second platform that they graduate to when they realize, hey, the first platform just didn't give me enough control to do what I needed to do, right? I would almost equate it to like, think of an Excel spreadsheet. I would say the bulk of our competitors are like an Excel spreadsheet that doesn't have functions. They have all the buttons at the top and they can do a lot of stuff, but they can't just write custom functions to do whatever they want. And we would be more like an Excel with functions. So we can actually write those custom logical statements that allow you to basically conform the platform to your business, which is easier than conforming your business and all your employees to do what the platform needs you to do.
An interesting thing that's coming out as you're describing all of these challenges and the way that your platform works and the type of work your customers are doing is that you're very obviously very experienced in these problem domains. And I'm wondering what you see as the kind of requirement and the competitive advantage of having domain expertise in the types of businesses that your clients are running. So food service, hospitality, and just the level of importance of understanding those businesses at a deep level in order to be able to build a product that actually solves problems for them.
Our platform is vertical agnostic, meaning it is more like an Excel in the respect of I can go to oil and gas and I could go to anywhere I want and the stuff would function properly because there's nothing that's hard coded about it. It's all custom, not like custom development. It's just a platform like an Excel where, an Excel can be a shopping list or it can be the spreadsheet that you use to run a multinational corporation and do financial analysis on. Like it has that power to do that. But I would say the domain expertise comes in more on the marketing and sales side of things. Like we're a bootstrap startup. We haven't raised any money. We have no investors. But, we came in and the thing was we were a bootstrap startup. So we had to choose a vertical to start in because you can't be all things to all people. And restaurants was the natural one for us to start in because of my experience at Quiznos running that auditing program. And then my other business partner, Eric, he was a restaurant, he was a waiter and a bartender. Even our head developer ran the McDonald's drive-through in his town in Minnesota, back in the day. So like in high school before he was a developer. So we all spoke restaurant. And that is so important when you're talking to clients and you're creating content, blog content and podcast content, that you can actually speak the vernacular of the customer and understand what problems they're trying to solve that are unique to their business. You know what I mean? Because the system is more like an Excel, you can put any data in there and do any equations and that type of stuff, and it doesn't matter. But definitely from a marketing and sales perspective, this is massively important to having real conversations and being able to come up with useful real world use cases that you can help people solve stuff on.
Another interesting angle is that you're talking about the role of periodic audits in terms of making sure that the business can identify and address systematic problems that are kind of the macro scale, and that the work that you're doing and some of your competitors can help drive some of the more micro scale efficiencies of making sure that the food is the right temperature, making sure that the line has been prepped properly so that you don't have these interruptions in terms of the food service production. I'm wondering, what are some of the other types of inefficiency that these businesses are contending with, and some of the ways that those inefficiencies can compound across multiple locations as you scale the business, and the ways that they're using the information and the insights that you're able to provide to be able to feed back into their on-location processes and policies to kind of optimize those cycles.
Great example of this. So like the cool thing about our platform is that, the day you implement our platform, the first day we start collecting data that's usable, right? And our platform helps the business at the location level, at what we would call the district or above store level, the VP level, all the way up to corporate. So because we're now collecting data and shedding light or visibility onto how the business is actually operating. So at the store level, we are focused on controlling what you can control and doing what you're supposed to do every day to make sure you're safe, you're clean, and you're ready for guests, right? So at the store level, it's all about taking the guesswork out of running the business. And when you look at the current labor market, the amount of turnover, especially in food service, the great restaurant exodus that happened during COVID, where so many of the professionals in our industry, and I mean professionals, I mean managers and servers and chefs and every level, just said, I'm done. I can't deal with this anymore. And they went to other businesses. We've lost probably over 1 million experienced people, if not more, in the hospitality industry. Just people bolted because they couldn't deal anymore. So at the restaurant level, it's all about daily operations and taking the guesswork out of the business and making sure we can control what we can control. But once you move up one level, so like in a Starbucks or a typical corporate-owned chain, you're going to have one district manager for something around 10-ish, give or take a couple on either side of that, locations. And that guy's job is to make sure that those 10 stores are operating the best that they can operate and that they're supporting those general managers and their teams to deliver great service and do good things, right? And that's in a corporate franchise, in a, like, let's say a corporate-owned business where they own the stores. And in Dunkin', that district manager is going to be working with about 70 to 100 restaurants, and they're going to be primarily working with the franchisees to make them better at operating their stores, right? But at that level, you now give somebody the ability to see what's happening in all their locations operationally in real time. And so they can now address problems at one location while they're sitting in another, and they don't have to physically be there to coach and direct. So it extends their effectiveness at that district manager level to be able to manage multiple locations simultaneously better. And then that data just keeps cascading up the chain to corporate, where now they have a viewpoint of the entire system. And when we started a big national burrito chain, and they have like 750 locations, we interviewed them like a couple of months after they started, and we interviewed the guy that was managing the program, and it's usually an operations services role, which is the technology wing of operations that purchases and implements products for the ops teams in the field. He gave us this great quote. He said, "You help us identify problems we didn't even know we had, and you keep us from making multi-million-dollar mistakes," which, I mean, as a marketing quote, is a pretty damn good marketing quote. But there was a specific instance of this, right? Kind of elaborate on it. But basically, they were getting reporting that their restaurants were dirty. And they were like, oh no. And with that level of information, right? Hey, your restaurants are dirty. They were like thinking to themselves, well, what we'll do is we'll add a couple more labor hours per lunch and per dinner during the rushes to offset. So we have someone out in the front of the house just cleaning the restaurant. Make sure the restaurant's clean. Clean is one of the top 3 pillars of success of any multi-location businesses. It's actually the top one, being clean. So they were like, with the amount of information they had, reports coming in and the restaurants were dirty, that was their initial thought process. And to add those 2 to 4 hours a day in those locations, if you just did the simple math at $15 an hour, you're basically over $5 million a year in new labor costs just for their 350 restaurants, plus not even including all the training and COBRA and employment, blah, blah, blah costs. It could be maybe even, 20 or 30% higher than that. So that was their initial thought. We're going to do that. But then they utilized the platform to crowdsource information from the restaurants, to get their people in the restaurants and really start identifying what was actually going on. So they started asking their teams, because that's a big part of what we do, is we require comments and photos when things are wrong. So we can crowdsource data from the line employee and get that data up to corporate in an easy, effective way where they can just look at photos from across the chain or look at all the comments that are coming in, and they can see what's actually happening. And they can obviously change their questions or add new questions to dig deeper when something's been identified. And that's exactly what they did. They identified that this dirty restaurant assumption was just a high level assumption. And when they got into the nitty gritty, they figured out their trash cans were too small, which was a $20 fix at certain locations versus, hiring another guy for 4 hours a week type of thing. And so that's where that quote came from. You kept us from making a multi-million-dollar mistake, because they were literally thinking, okay, we've got to pull the trigger on these extra employees. And they were like, because that was the level of understanding they had of their issue. And at that level of understanding, that was a good decision to make. We got dirty restaurants. Let's get some people in here to clean them. It's like logical, But when they were able to dig deeper and crowdsource data and get questions answered and drill in and start looking at photos, they realized very quickly this is a trash can issue. That is a much simpler fix. And they were able to implement those bigger trash cans in certain locations, and they solved their problem. But the platform facilitated that, right? And in a quick and easy way. I think that answers the question, but I think that's how it's being used at all levels of the business. The employee now has a say to corporate on what's really happening, right? And they can make an impact in the business. And I'm going to keep going here, but this is a kind of a theory of mine, but I feel like operations technology, like our platform, or operations management, like our platform, is going to be one of the next big technology revolutions in multi-location businesses. These aren't just restaurants. These are retail. This is automotive. This is dental, medical, you name it. Like, there's all these giant multi-location chains and that have never had access to really control operationally what's happening. But more importantly than the control part is they've never had real-time access to operations data where they can identify issues, and then having a platform like ours where you can identify an issue, crowdsource a response, like, hey, what is really happening? Is there an easy way to fix this? And then implement a change, meaning they just change the checklist or the procedure right in the platform, a complete feedback loop, if you will, within the platform to identify an issue, to crowdsource a solution, and then have a place to implement a change, all within one system. I do believe that those businesses that are adopting this type of technology in their day-to-day operations, it's going to be the next big competitive lift. And what we're finding is that it's generally not one issue. Like, when you have a bad experience at any of these businesses, it's not because generally one giant horrible thing happened to you. It's actually the opposite. It's this sort of death by 1,000 cut type of deal where a bunch of little things sucked and you were like, this blows. Like, you go in and the line is long, the floor is sticky, your table's sticky, there weren't any straws. It's like the bathroom was kind of dirty. Any one of those things would not be enough to throw your experience off the deep end, but it was the sum of the parts, all these little things that just kind of sucked because they didn't do a good job of managing their business, that added up for you to go have a blah experience, right? And so right now you have these companies that are like our clients and our competitors' clients who are getting this data and they're identifying their problems and they're fixing them faster than their competitors who don't have solutions like ours. And as they get better at doing that, they're going to start incrementally growing. And I think what's going to end up happening is there's going to be a bunch of people that were neck and neck competing against each other today. And in 2 or 3 years, they're going to look at their competitor and be like, how is this guy doing so much better than us? And you're not going to be able to attribute it, once again, to one thing. Oh, they cut lettuce prices. It's because they're addressing these death by 1,000 cut things that they can control better, faster than their competitor. And then once you start making customers happier, repeat sales, new sales, more marketing dollars, better money, more money to go get better positions in the strip malls, get into the best strip malls, your success is just like that snowball rolling down a mountain. And it legitimately just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And, that Avis to your Hertz is just going to be sitting there going, what the heck's happening? You know what I mean? How are these guys blowing us out of the water? How did they open 100 stores last year or 1,000 stores, So I think this is going to be a whole revolution for these businesses because it's a huge gap that we've got visibility into everything else, manufacturing, supply chain, sales. We just don't have visibility into operations. But once we start getting that, the guys that get it are going to start crushing it.
RudderStack helps you build a customer data platform on your warehouse or data lake. Instead of trapping data in a black box, they enable you to easily collect customer data from the entire stack and build an identity graph on your warehouse, giving you full visibility and control. Their SDKs make event streaming from any app or website easy, and their state-of-the-art reverse ETL pipelines enable you to send enriched data to any cloud tool. Sign up for free, or just get the free t-shirt for being a listener of the Data Engineering Podcast at dataengineeringpodcast.com/rudder. Digging now into your platform itself, can you give a bit of insight into the technical implementation and the way that you think about the design and requirements and the overall evolution of the kind of platform design and the goals that you're trying to achieve with it?
So, it's interesting when you build software from scratch, you know what I mean? It would be great if this all operated in a vacuum, if you will, and you could just sit down on day one and sketch it all out and just build it until it was done and then release it into the world, right? But that's not the reality of the world we live in. I often think about software development as being a lot like capitalism as a system in whole, in that you're being pulled by the demands of the marketplace, meaning your customers are telling you don't have a feature or some functionality that they think is important. You're being pushed by what your competitors are doing, right? Like they are adding features and functionality that other people like. And so you're like, crap, I got to go do that too. And so you end up building it and kind of like fits and starts. So you go, okay, well, we have our core product and we can do checklists now. Okay, good. And then you go, well, we don't have enough reports. So then you're like, okay, well, let's go build some reports real quick. So then you build version 1 of your reports and then you get those out there. So now you can say, hey, we've got reports. And then you go, oh, well, we need tasks now, which are different than checklists. A checklist is basically a list of individual tasks, but they're easier to kind of complete, right? So now we need tasks. So then you go build version 1 of tasks. So it's like you constantly are building out all these MVPs of your features, across the board, better administration, better this, better messaging, better notifications. And you end up, as you're creating this product, you have 20 different feature points that are all on MVP level. You literally have to stop developing what you're doing because you realize you're starting to lose deals because you don't have this thing. And that's the capitalist part of it all, right? And so you go, we keep losing these deals because we don't have this. So now we have to stop whatever we were working on and go add a version of this so we can at least say we have enough to, not get blown out of the water in the pre-process, and we can at least get to a pilot or further into the deals flow. And so we did that for 5 years, right? We just kept adding feature sets and everything worked, right? It was always important that it worked. Because if it doesn't work, then you have other issues, which is massive customer support tickets, and you have a lot of churn. So we always built things that worked and got them out. And thank God, my developer, my head of development, he's actually a partner in the company. And I think he was already a great developer. Just anybody who's looking to start a company and you're looking to start it from scratch and you're looking to do it bootstrapped, where you're not just going to be able to go out and just throw down big salaries on people to get the best people in. You're actually sweat equity bootstrapping this thing. You should make your head of development a partner. They don't have to have 1,000,000% of the company and they don't, whatever, but you should make them a partner because our developer from day one wasn't an employee, he was a partner. And so when, you hit the 1,000,000 decisions that a developer has to make every single day when they're coding, he always leaned, not an employee goes, okay, this is what the spec says, and can I hard code this? Or can I make it extensible and make it so that it can work in multiple different things? And then they have a boss telling them, hey, we got to get this code done. And they don't have any say in the company and they might not even be there in a year. And so they choose the easiest path for them to get the code out as quick as possible. But generally, that's more of a hard-coded, less extensible, less flexible thing unless that was completely spec'd in. And developers make that decision 100 times a day. And I think from our perspective, our developer always thought like a partner, always thought about the future, always pushed back on us and said, hey, we're going to do it right the first time and we're not going to revisit it. So yes, it's going to take a little bit longer, which is miserable for me because I'm not a patient person and I'm dealing in the real world trying to get code out so I can win some deals so I could get a paycheck. I was literally fighting to get a paycheck, but he did it that way and it's been the best for us forever. So, just as a side note, for those of you who are at MIT or who listen to podcasts that are going to go bootstrap this thing, highly think about giving your guys some equity. And they can earn into it. And I'm happy to tell you how we structured ours because I got it off a buddy of mine and it worked out really good for us. But anyways, him being a partner, that led to better development overall. But it didn't stop us from having all these feature sets that were kind of MVP, They worked, they were good, they got the job done, we could market and sell off of them, and they added value to the platform, but they're all at, I would say, different phases of doneness, if you will, right? Like some of them are 80% done, some are 30% done. And so probably for the first 5 or so years, it was just getting all of the different modules that you kind of needed to be able to compete in the world and say you could do stuff. And then about 2 years ago, once we kind of hit that level of doneness, we made an agreement that we would go through, before we started adding a bunch of new stuff, we would go through and try to get all those MVP things to like a level of 100% done. Not saying that we'll never add anything to them in the future, but they were still like in our rule builder, there's 2 parts to our rule builder, and our rule builder it's still better than everybody else's, but it's probably at 40% of what we envision it being done as. You know what I mean? And there's another 60% to do. And we've been working on reports and dashboards for probably like 18 of the last 24 months. And it's not been 24 of the last 24 because we sold a couple of deals where we had to add some functionality. And so we had to pump that in to that 18 months in there. But so we are just simply going through and looking at all the modules and going, how can we get this to a point where not only is it like a thing that works, but it's like the best version of itself so that the whole platform is like just amazeballs across the board, right? So that's kind of how we've been focusing on it from a development perspective. And, it's a constant battle. Like I said, it's like capitalism. Like, if somebody starts making a grumble over here, there's a need or a want, and it's going to affect sales or customer satisfaction, then, sometimes we have to stop what we're doing and prioritize this other thing and fill this gap. That's what we have to do. And so you have to be flexible in this world, but then it's also frustrating because like every time we do like that quick fix for a customer, I know there's something that I really want that's getting kicked back a couple of months. You know what I mean? And it's tough because there's some things in there that I know we're going to have in the future that I'm like, I cannot wait because they're going to just propel our competitive advantage so much further, and what our core strengths are. So it's just like, it's really tough. And if you're not a patient person, which I am not, it is even tougher.
Another interesting element of the data question of what you're working with is the challenge of kind of data quality, data validation. You already mentioned a little bit about kind of the lineage aspect of making sure that you can track, who entered the data, how it was entered, when it was entered, where it went. But because of the fact that you are relying on, site employees who are going to have different motivations, different kind of levels of commitment to it, they're saying, oh, I just have to fill out this checklist so I can get to the next thing. Or some of them are, maybe the site managers. And so they're very invested in making sure that everything is correct. I'm just curious how you approach some of that challenge of data quality, data validation, given the fact that there is a human involved and just trying to account for that aspect.
Absolutely. That's great. And like, there's two parts to that. One is metadata, right? We haven't even talked about metadata. Like, I should have probably mentioned it earlier when we talked about the actual data types of data we're collecting, but we're also collecting metadata on every response. And the metadata is where it was done geolocation wise. We're capturing a geocode or coordinates on every question being answered. We're also capturing the date timestamp of when they answered it. Right. So that's two factors of metadata that we capture on every question. So you're right. Here's the issue. And I have tried, and if anybody on this podcast knows a way to do this that doesn't involve like some sort of electroshock through a tablet or something, you can call me up. And tell me how you can do it. The one thing I can't do is I can't make people be honest or do their jobs correctly. And man, I have tried to brainstorm the hell out of that, but I cannot figure it out. There's nothing I can do to make you go and diligently walk around and do what you're supposed to do. There's always a way to cheat the system, right? And so one of the things that we've invented, and this is what I was mentioning to you offline earlier, that I'm curious if you've ever heard of this anywhere else. We are in this blessed position because we are an analytics platform, but we control the means of data entry. If you're Locker or, whatever, Microsoft BI, if you're working on one of those platforms, you can only connect to data that's already in databases that's coming in. And you now have the problem of scrubbing the data, right? So you're making decisions off of good data, not garbage data. But because we control the means of data entry, means it's coming through our system or it be coming in through our sensors, I suppose, which are pretty locked down, closed loop systems, though I guess you could move a sensor. You could have all the sensors in one fridge and everything else could be 90 degrees, but that would be dumb. I don't know why you would do that. But like, we have this ability to do this thing, which I have named as a feature set as called data accuracy scoring. So I can look at the checklist that's being completed in real time. I can determine if you are pencil whipping it or being dishonest or are not on site or are not using the proper equipment. And I can tag, we call it a question response set. That's basically a completed checklist. I can tag the response set with accurate or not accurate. And if it's not accurate, I can tag it with why I'm telling you it's not accurate. And what that does is at a checklist level, and it's most prevalent in our dashboards, you can go into the dashboard and you can see all the response set tags. So you can literally do one click on a checklist and click the accurate tab, and you've now just excluded from your response set all the not accurate data. And by the way, I preach to my customers, all the data is good. Because what we do is we tell you what's really happening in your business. So the not accurate data is as valuable as the accurate data, but for different things. So if I need to make a decision on a question that's being answered by people, like for instance, one of our companies, they changed how they stored, they moved the position of sour cream on a make table and they put an ice sleeve around it. And they actually wanted to see if this ice sleeve was actually doing anything to keep the sour cream colder, because sour cream's thick. It could be one of those things that a health inspector would go to pretty quickly because they go, I bet I can catch them wrong here. You know what I mean? So like they wanted to look at just those sour cream temps. Well, because of our system, they could click on the accurate tag. They could then filter out all the inaccurate BS data and just look at accurate readings. They could get a better sense on that question level. Okay, did this ice sleeve actually help the sour cream temps? The not accurate data is not good for looking at actually what's happening. The not accurate data is really good to look at from a coaching managerial perspective of who's not doing this correctly and how can I coach them on the why behind this so that I can get them to do what they're supposed to do, right? That's the difference. So all the data is good. It's all coming in from these human beings. So like you said, they have different motivations. Most of their motivation is to get this done as quickly as possible to get on to other stuff that I feel is more important. And so I just want to give them a complete picture of this is what's actually happening in your business. And this is how the accurate and not accurate data helps your you manage your business better. And it's a really interesting phenomenon in restaurants. There's a culture in restaurants specifically, but I suspect it's a culture across the world, which was when you had paper checklists, right? No one ever looked at them. No one ever used the data. You weren't very rarely getting caught in real time or within, a day, a shift of not doing those procedures. So the only people, which we find is about 20%, use the Pareto principle here, 20% of the people, because they are systems-driven people, because they value systems and they understand the value of systems, taking away the guesswork, making it easier, reducing stress, those kinds of things. They embrace systems, whether people are following up with them or not. 20% of the people are going to do the systems because that's their job or they value the benefits of the system, right? 80% don't care. And especially because in the restaurant industry, they always did them on paper. And like I said, no one ever followed up on them. No one ever looked at them. You got in trouble 4 months later when someone came in to audit the restaurant. Hey, you haven't been doing your checklist. Yeah, okay, cool. And like on a lot of the audits, like the question about doing your checklist or not is like, if you miss it, it maybe got you down from 100 to 98. It had no effect on your life. There was no consequence for not doing them. People just didn't do them. And so it's this giant joke in the restaurant industry that every checklist you look at is pencil whipped. And we even catch a lot of pencil whipping in our platform all the time, because unless you're managing to the pencil whipping, you're not going to change the behavior. And what's interesting about it too, just as a side note, is because I have this rule builder, I can lock these things down, man. I can make it so you couldn't do jack if you were doing it wrong. But then what happens is when you do it that way, people just stop using the platform. They say it's impossible to do their job, and it is. So what we decided to do was take a more passive approach to this, allow people to do bad things, but just track the bad things so that management could address it, because it technically is a management issue. It's not a platform issue, right? Like if you're not doing your job, it has nothing to do with the platform. It has to do with you're not doing your job, and managers need to come and talk to you. Your bosses need to talk to you about doing your job better. So that's kind of how we approached that aspect of it. But that's that data accuracy scoring thing. Like I don't know any analytics platform that has the capability of tagging stuff and making it one click to get accurate or not accurate data.
Absolutely. And another interesting element of this is the way that you structure the inputs and the types of questions that you're asking in order to kind of encourage compliance, encourage cooperation, where if you just say, okay, I need you to check off these 30 things on this checklist just to show that you are doing the different things, people aren't going to care. They're going to say, this is onerous, this makes no sense, it's not actually contributing any value. And just figuring out what is that balancing act of collecting the information that you need, but doing it in a way that is kind of empathetic to the employee who has to do that work, and making sure that you're not wasting their time just because you are curious about what's happening in your business.
Absolutely. And that's where I feel like we're still in the infancy of this, because we are just taking these paper checklists and converting them over, and we can add dynamic elements to them. I'll get into that in a second. But like the reality is that like those checklists were the lowest common denominator checklists. They had to be, because they had to fit on 1 to 2 pages of paper, and they had to just sort of incorporate the entire world, right? For every different restaurant just had to be kind of in there, There are a lot of things that we can do personally that our competitors can't, once again, because we have this rule builder, we have this function capability that we can do to make this better. And let me give you some examples. One thing is Taco Bell, their temp log, they have about 4 or 6 ingredients that they want to temp, but they usually run 2 to 3 different lines. So if you think about a Taco Bell, you have 2 exact or maybe even 3 versions of the exact same line, 1 for drive-through and 2 for in-store dining, right? Well, they only care about like taco meat, the cheese, the chicken, the steak. Like there's 4 like rice and beans. They only care about those ingredients. But like on their paper checklist, they would go, okay, line 1, write down what you temped and then what the temperature was. And then you would do that for 2 items on each line. So like that ended up being like a 55 or 60 questions that if you did this on paper, you would have to go fill in. So because we have this rule builder, I was like, well, this doesn't make any sense. Like, first of all, if you leave it up to the person, they're just going to keep temping cheese sauce because they know that was hot, right? And then you're not going to get like a spread or the safety or the coverage you want. So what I ended up doing is I built in a randomization model where it was random. So depending on when you got the checklist, you got version A or version B of this line check. And what I did was I strategically did different ingredients on each line across the system. But I also told the people what they had to temp. So it might be ground beef and beans on line 1, but then it was chicken and cheese sauce on line 2. And then line 3 might have been rice and steak, right? So you got full coverage of food safety across 3 lines, but you also didn't have to think about it. Does that make sense? So that's like one way we were able to design a more efficient checklist for those guys. And there was a franchisee, by the way, not talking about corporate. We were able to design a more efficient checklist to do that. The other thing is, because we have this rule builder, business logic engine, we know who's completing the checklist. So we can take that good, like we shouldn't treat all employees equal. If you're a good employee who never pencil whipped and it's like always in there taking comments and doing it correctly, you can get an easier version of the checklist. And if you're a bad employee, I can give you a harder version of the checklist. And when I say harder, I just mean I would probably just add more photos, because photos require you to walk over to a place and take a picture, but that action drags you from being able to pencil whip this thing in a booth in the front. So like our big analogy is always like, I don't want people to come in, grab a cigarette, grab a cup of coffee and bang out their food safety checklist for the next 15 hours at 7 in the morning, right? I want them to go at 4 before dinner starts and make sure the food's safe then, so we don't get a bunch of people sick at dinner. So by adding more photos and adding more like temperatures that you have to do with a thermometer, I can actually make the checklist force the person to at least walk to that general area. And then hopefully they'll just do the work because it's the less onerous thing to do, right? So I can do those kinds of things as well. And what I'm finding is like, a lot of these people become like dictators, the checklist writers, not us, but like the clients. They become like these dictators because they've never had control, and they build these hour-and-a-half long checklists that like nobody could ever do because they're just too busy running the restaurant to do. And it is a battle for us to try to fight these guys and go, hey, man, you need to chill out. And like, you're making it too hard on your team. You know what I mean? And like, I try to get them to a point, like, ideally, this should only be a 10 or 15 minute process that hits those key items. And that's where randomization can come in too, because you can get randomization across a day. Because some of these guys are doing these checklists every 4 hours. We couldn't randomize things so we get coverage across an entire table or food group by doing the 2 questions every 4 hours versus trying to do 20 questions every 4 hours. Do you know what I mean? Like at some point we have to make some assumptions that like, if the table's cold, then the food in the table's cold and we should be fine. We don't have to temp every ingredient. So there is like a lot of play there. And one of the cool things we can do too, just as a side note, we can do what we call a dynamic checklist, which means like, if you take a chain of restaurants, 90% of them are the same, but 10% is different. They might have different equipment. They might be in a mall versus a drive-through versus, all these different little attributes, testing of different food items and stuff like that, different menus. We can build one checklist that can dynamically conform to each location as it loads so that it's always what we call sheet to shelf. That's another benefit of using a system like ours, is that now you can require every question to be answered and you take the guesswork out of the guy. You don't need some high school kid determining whether this cooler temperature is important or not. You just need him to go temp it and tell you what it is. So we can do stuff like that too. And those are all things that we try to do within the checklists to make people do them correctly. But I do think there's got to be a revolution in checklist design to really figure out what's important and what's not. Because right now we're working off this antiquated 1980s paper version, that's been just updated with menu changes over the years. And it's not really like we're in the infancy. We need to get to that next generation where where people are designing checklists based off of what makes the most operational sense to check to make sure we accomplish our goal as quickly as possible.
You wake up to a Slack message from your CEO, who's upset because the company's revenue dashboard is broken. You're told to fix it before this morning's board meeting, which is just minutes away. Enter Metaplane, the industry's only self-serve data observability tool. In just a few clicks, you identify the issue's root cause, conduct an impact analysis, and save the day. Data leaders at Imperfect Foods, Drift, and Vendor love Metaplane because it helps them catch, investigate, and fix data quality issues before their stakeholders ever notice they exist. Setup takes 30 minutes. You can literally get up and running with Metaplane by the end of this podcast. Sign up for a free forever plan at dataengineeringpodcast.com/metaplane or try out their most advanced features with a 14-day free trial. And if you mention the podcast, you get a free In Data We Trust World Tour t-shirt. In terms of your experience of building this platform, working with your customers, understanding, how that is being applied to these different businesses, and particularly as you start to expand across verticals, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen the platform used?
That's my favorite part, dude. Honestly, when I see people do something in our platform that I had I never even thought of before, I'm like, oh, this is the best. And it's kind of cool too, just as a side note, as my job has evolved and as we've grown over the years, I'm doing less and less daily operational stuff. And that frees me up to go, and kind of one of my main roles now is to meet people in these other verticals and just hang out with them and see what their challenges are and try to figure out, can we help them do their job better, right? And get those first use cases for that vertical, but also just understand what their business is really doing, right? So here's a dumb one, but it's totally cool. The Pizza Huts they use their register as also their time clocks, right? And so it can produce a ratio, which I don't understand the ratio at all. I don't know how they calculate it. All I know is that anything less than a -2 is good, and it's a labor to sales ratio. And once again, for my job, it's really not important that I know how it goes into it. I just know less than a -2 is good. So -4, good, right? And so they have a checklist at these 75 Pizza Huts where every 2 hours they make the guy go in, pull that number, and he puts it in our system. And then we can obviously evaluate the number. And if the number is a 0 or a 1 or a 2, then when they submit that, we notify the management team of the company that says, hey, dude, this labor ratio is too high to sales right now. So somebody can follow up that day. Most people get that labor to sales number for Tuesday on Wednesday when they cannot impact a change that affects profitability, right? But if you can get that in real time, every 2 hours, if the labor's running high, then somebody can pick up a phone and call the restaurant and be like, hey, why is labor running so high? And there might be a reasonable excuse. We're training new people. We have a giant catering order at 7:00. I needed 5 guys in here making pizzas. Totally understand it. No problems. That's just a normal aspect of business. But being able to catch that in real time and get it to the right people, that's a really interesting use case. Another interesting use case that I'm working on right now, I have a guy who is on the cutting edge of recycling paint. And he recycles paint in New York and in Colorado and Texas, the big paint drives, and the state pays him to take the paint and mess with it. They've got to report to the state about how many pallets, how many buckets, how many gallons of paint came in, and then what happened to the cans and what happened to the plastic buckets and how much went out the door. You know what I mean? They've got to be able to justify to the state that they're actually doing an environmental good. And so right now they do that on slips of paper. You know what I mean? They just jot them down on paper, and then this guy has to data enter it all in at the end. So we're working on an app, we're working on a checklist where these things come in, they can be just data entering that stuff into the system as it comes in, taking photos of it, so that when they have to go to report to the state, it's here's the report. I just emailed it to you, versus, having to run all this stuff in an Excel and double check every number and whatnot. So that's another interesting use case. We are getting some interesting use cases. I probably had some of the first digital COVID screens by March 20th of 20. I had national chains using my COVID health screens, where it was a series of questions that you went through to determine. That's the paper you get everywhere you go, blah, 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 every symptoms. We were doing that digitally, but And so I have millions and millions of rows of health screens, but I had built one that people could do at home before they drove into the town, because it was actually for a hotel in San Francisco, because we were like, well, why the heck do we want to get this person who has to sit in San Francisco traffic, and this could be true of any major metropolitan area, have to drive downtown, find parking, come to the back door, and then we find out that they have a fever and they can't work, or they took the train, or now you've got COVID germs on your back door or in your little entry to your building. So we literally built one that people could do at home. They could take a picture of their thermometer, they could answer the questions, and then it would alert their bosses, and it would tell them right in the checklist, like, you cannot come into work today. We're alerting your bosses, stay home. Like, we built that kind of interesting stuff too. Because it's like an Excel, man, it's just like we can just build cool stuff that help people actually run their business. And that's the most exciting thing ever. Because, when we first started, I knew every customer and I knew every checklist because I was a part of every one of them. And now that we're bigger, it's like people just keep using the system and doing cool stuff. And I don't even know of it sometimes, And then I find out about it and it's like, wow, this is I built something, It's cool. That's the coolest part of being a software founder, is that when people actually utilize your platform and do things that you never envisioned, or they just keep staying on and keep paying you and they don't leave. And you're just like, wow, this is real. You know what I mean? We did something that's didn't exist before. And now people see value in it. That's the best part.
And in terms of your work on building this platform, bootstrapping it, understanding the problems that your customers are trying to address and how to provide a kind of technological solution that is able to be repeatable and scalable, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
Definitely, I would say, and you asked this question earlier about product knowledge or vertical knowledge. You don't want to start in a vertical that you have no knowledge in, You're just adding more complexity and pain to your world than you need, right? We spoke restaurant, but we spoke it well. And we actually had a background in restaurants that we could trade off of and gave us some credibility. So I think that first part is huge. The second part is when you're bootstrapping, everything takes 4 times longer than you think. I mean, first of all, I developed for about 5 years, I developed workflows. In our previous company, we were in the Semantic Partner Channel before Semantic got bought by Broadcom. And we did a product called Semantic Workflow, where we did integrations to large enterprise Semantic customers, usually integrating security software into help desks or IT management software, that kind of thing. I spent a lot of time at TJ Maxx outside of Boston, working on stuff for those guys. And that was not TJ Maxx in general, but that was a very horrible job because we were building custom software brand new all the time. That was brutal because they were just consulting gigs and they were expensive and they were hard. It was such a refresher to come over here and just do one thing. But, developers cannot tell you how long anything's going to take. And it's always 3 to 4x longer than they think it's going to take. And I equate development to every HGTV show where they're rehabbing an old house and then they have to do something in the basement, Love It or Leave It up in Canada or whatever, where, then they're all mad at her, the lady, because she's trying to rehab their basement and they've got a puddle and piranhas in there and wolves living in the den. Well, the wolves are biting the construction workers and we're going to go over budget and now I can't have a pool table, and you're like, whatever, dude. That's what development's like. It always takes longer. The human brain can't fathom all of the little challenges that are going to pop up and little things that are going to take time to solve. So if you're bootstrapping, you've got to understand that's everything's going to take 10x longer, I didn't tell you this, but when we first built our platform, we had a version on Semantic Workflow that I had built in 2013 and 2014 and had beta tested and got into a chain of restaurants on the East Coast, 18-unit chain. And that was our initial product. And one of the reasons our developer came on, and this is something for you guys that are going to be founders, developers get asked all the time to join companies. If they know how to code, they get asked constantly to join companies but the companies never have a business plan. It's always like, hey, I've got an idea for an app. You want to come develop it for free and then we'll make $1 million? And developers are tired of that. They're like, screw you. I'm not going to do this. Like, because they know like they're never going to turn into anything. And everything looks good and simple at a 30,000 foot level. It's when you get on the ground and start actually implementing it that you realize there's 4,000 tech challenges that you didn't expect and that it's going to be harder and take longer. And then all these ideas fizzle. One of the reasons our developer came on with us, because we were another guys that came to him and said we had an idea, is because we had a beta platform that we had built on workflow, which most of you aren't going to be able to do, but unless you know how to code something, right? But we had a beta platform and we were fronting all the cash. So that's why our developer actually signed on with us. But our first version of the platform was, I guess, the workflow version, which was just a stopgap to start marketing and selling on day one, but was never going to be the platform forever. We were getting off of it. We had something on day one. We could at least go out and sell and demo and have conversations and learn how to do all that because we had never done that before anyways. But our first version was a very 2015 version where we had a hand-coded, like our own app that we had coded, a front-end mobile app that you could use on an iPad or a phone or on Android and do the checklist. But we actually built our back end on a workflow platform. So it was actually a platform called Decisions, which was basically the people who had built Semantic Workflow. So we knew them. When they had sold out to Semantic, they went and built Decisions right after it. So we were getting onto a platform. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was similar. And we used the workflow platform for like stuff like user management, location management, reporting, rules, all those kinds of things. So we had an app, then the data was just a data collection point that then shipped all the data into our API that the workflow platform then did. So that was a good hybrid model. That's an antiquated model in that most people will not buy an app or a platform that's got an app and a back end that aren't the same. Like that's antiquated, right? That's so 2015. You know what I mean? It's not 2022. So, but that's how we did it. But that got us to market faster. So I would say the next part of this thing is if you're going to do this, you got to get selling even before you got to start having conversations. You got to have a website, a URL, a blog, and maybe a podcast when you're in development. And you have to start having conversations immediately, knowing that your software is coming and you have to be disciplined to get an MVP out and get it into people's hands as quick as possible and start getting customer feedback on what it's missing versus just trying to guess, because you oftentimes guess wrong about what's actually important and what's not important. Just know that your development's going to take longer and your sales are going to take longer too, by 2 or 3 or 4 times. So you have to start having conversations like the day you start the company, even though you have nothing to show for it. You have to start learning and exploring and walking the floor if it's in manufacturing and just understanding what's actually happening. And then you just got to keep going. I can't stress it enough, like you just have to keep going. We didn't make money for years, It took us we weren't a unicorn. We just didn't have $1 billion and 100 developers on day one. We had 3 guys and we just had to keep battling every year. And the only reason we didn't stop, and we should have stopped. There's many times where we probably should have been let's just throw in the towel. But it was because the numbers, even though it was painfully slow, were creeping up. They were never going down for very long, Even though we weren't a unicorn, we weren't a rocket ship, we didn't go from 0 to 1 million in 6 months. We went from 0 to 500 in 6 months, The numbers kept creeping up. That's the one reason why I think we both kept going and kept battling it out. It was because we just were getting better and we weren't losing customers. That was a huge part of this. But, unicorns are unicorns. We all hear about them and we think about how many millions of dollars their founders make. And it's kind of our motivation, but 99.9% of us aren't unicorns. And you just have to keep battling. And if your numbers are going up, even if it's slightly, I think you got to keep going. You got to keep battling, because it wasn't until April of 2017, after we got off that workflow platform, had recoded our entire backend and added schedules, that we really started to get good traction in demos. So 2.5 years, almost 2.5 years in, is when we finally had a platform that we could show people that was like, oh, that's an interesting feature that like nobody else has. This might be something I want to use. It took that long, because we only had one main developer. And I had actually coded a lot of the workflow back end just to make things work in year one. So, just keep battling. And then, you know what? It really does start to happen. It's kind of like when they talk about when you meet your spouse and you're like, you just know type of thing. And like, until you just know, you don't know, and you don't understand that concept. But when you meet the person you're supposed to be with, you go, oh, I just knew. Like, this was the right person. This doesn't feel weird. We really started to get momentum in like 2019. We started winning big enterprise head-to-head battles, and we were able to win. That was the kind of turning point year from us, where we went from like a tiny company to like kind of a small company. Yeah, we went from teeny tiny to small, But like that was a big year. And then really since 2019 on, it's just gotten easier. And like we'll get deals today that in 2017, I would have like cried and like hugged people. We'll get those like on a daily basis now. And I'm like, that's cool. But like sometimes I have to remind myself, if this deal had come in 2016, you would have literally like had a heart attack because would not have believed that you were fortunate enough to get this deal, because we are just growing and we're just getting bigger and we're getting faster and we're getting better. And it does get better. But don't believe it's going to be easy or it's going to be fast, because it's not. And it's going to require a level of patience that you can't even imagine. like Herculean patience.
For people who are interested in being able to gain better insights into their business or understand more about kind of the unit economics of their different locations, what are the cases where Ops Analytica is the wrong choice?
I would say we don't do well with single unit operators. They just don't tend to stay on. And there's no mandate that they have to be on digital checklist system, which is a crime in and of itself, that we don't mandate temperature logs in any like digital fashion so that when someone screws up, we can actually like investigate it properly, which is just a failing of the federal government and the FDA. But we're not great for single unit operators. We are probably not the best choice for you if you just want to audit, because there are some platforms out there that are strictly audits, and the reporting's just a little bit easier because you don't have to account for those kinds of things. Also, I would say, we can build a simple checklist just as good as anybody else. But like, here's the thing. We're kind of like in the middle we're like on the low end on pricing. So like, I would like, it'd be different if I was like I'm on the technical edge, but I'm also the highest price. And I could say, well, if you don't really want all these advanced features, then, you shouldn't come to us because we're the sales force, right? You can go somewhere else and get something cheaper. But we're actually on the high end of technology, but we're on the low end of cost. So it's kind of tough. We can still get you on a great price and you don't have to use all of our advanced features. You know what I mean? So that's where we're kind of a unique thing. Like we're purposely small, nimble, and cheap so we can get as much market share as possible. Yeah, I would say that those kind of things. Single unit operators, probably not. And I would just say if you're, I guess that would be it really. Just, I would say small single unit operator businesses, or, here's the thing too, by the way, and this is a problem that founders have, and I especially have, is I have a way that like in my mind, because I have a hotel restaurant degree. I ran restaurants. I worked at this like auditing thing. I have very set ideas on how the platform is supposed to be used. And what I've learned over the last year is I got to shut up and not tell people how to use the platform, let them use it however they want. And as long as they're seeing value and they're happy and they're going to stay on, then however they're using it is cool by me. But that has been a huge lesson that I've had to learn, because I've sat there and told people you're doing it wrong, and they don't like to hear that. And rightfully so. It's like the old adage, the people who can't do teach, right? It's sort of the same thing. Like, well, if you could do restaurants, you'd be running restaurants. So why the heck are you in software, And so I've had to like shut up and learn that as long as the person's seeing value and they're happy, then however they're using it is fine. You know what I mean? Like I'm sure the guys that built Excel, when they found out like someone was putting a Christmas card list in there or putting in like a grocery list in there, they were like, it's not for groceries, it's for finance and science. And they had to like let it go and be like, who cares? They're using it. Like, let's just be happy that they're using it and they see value. And I feel like I'm in that growth as a founder to just shut up. So when you ask that question, it's kind of like, I was like in my mind going, well, you really need to be using it for all this advanced features. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, I've got some giant clients, a couple hundred units, that they just utilize it for like action plans when they visit the restaurants, and they're happy as clams. So why would I care? But that's all they want to use it for. They like it. They see value out of it. What do I care? You know, that's been tough for me because I'm very opinionated.
And are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing at Ops Analytica or the overall data challenges of multi-location businesses that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I just want to reiterate, because I don't want this to be like, I love our platform, and I hope that if someone's interested in learning more about it or looking for a way to collect data from the field, whatever that looks like, and being able to do some advanced calculation stuff, that they would reach out and check us out. But what I want to reiterate is this. I truly believe that operations management software and utilizing technology to uncover the black hole of what your employees are actually doing or what's happening out the world, right, in your locations, is I truly believe that that is the next technological revolution. And it's not only going to exist in being able to capture data, identify problems quicker, and then crowdsource solutions and then fix those problems because you have the means to do that all within this sort of operations management world, that I do believe it's truly going to increment sales up, and that businesses that embrace that, and you see it with the Walmarts and like the Amazons and their distribution centers and stuff, the efficiencies and how they get so good at stuff. That's what we're talking about, but we're just talking about it from human activity, whether it's the receptionist in a dental office to the restaurant employee to whatever. But also, we're rapidly approaching a world where we're going to have employees working next to sensors, working next to robots, grabbing data coming in from POS systems and from the internet. And these are all going to be siloed systems. You know, these operations management systems, I think, are going to, especially where we're trying to go, is to play the role to coordinate all of those siloed systems and to take that data in and make it actionable. So like, this is the next big technological battleground. We've got delivery, we've got online ordering, we got apps, we got all the things that facilitate sales. But what we need to get better at is making sure that when people go into our businesses, they have consistently good experiences in clean environments, and they get exactly what they paid for as fast as possible. And that can be your X-ray or your Egg McMuffin, but it's the same thing. And, you know, just as a whole, I want people out there to understand that this is next. Like, this has to go in place before you can have wide scale automation across your businesses, because you got to have a way to know what's actually happening and then tell these robots what to do. You know what I mean? Like, they're not just going to figure it out. So we've got to have this layer of integration and this layer of data. So I think that's important. I think too, just data-driven decisions are so much easier and so much less stressful to make than just gut feel experience-based decisions. So you can implement a system like this and actually make your managers and your leaders better because they can make better decisions. So I guess that would be the 2 points I'd want to get out there.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as the final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
The biggest thing I see is right now, we have to utilize people to hand enter the data. How can we get to a point where we can get the human data without having to stop somebody and having them enter it manually, right? Which I guess is sensors, but you know, like, are we going to do those like light studies that guy did in the early 1900s where he put lights on people's hands and did slow release film to watch them assemble a product to try to find where they crisscrossed and stuff? Like, how do we get to a point where we can either use like, because sensors are stationary. So sensors are, in the most part, sensors are usually stationary. IoT sensors are, at least. They're put on a device or in a box, or they measure a singular aspect. So that's fine, but that's not the answer. I think the answer is there a way where we could be collecting data off of a human being, maybe because they were wearing gloves or smart glasses or something, where we could be checking we could be collecting data as they move? Or can we get more mobile robots who can be doing some of these human activities so that a human doesn't have to physically sit there and enter data? That to me is the big question mark on where do we go next. And I will tell you, I'm partnering with a robot guy right now. We're trying to figure out, how do we get the data? And the thing is too, it's like, it's easy to put a robot on a stationary thing, but like, think about a restaurant. It's not a stationary thing. There's 50 different things you got to check on all over the place. So it's got to be mobile. You know what I mean? How can we get mobile data collection that comes in either off of a human or off of a robot, or cameras or sensors, that we'd have to have hundreds of them to do it right, How do we get that gap so someone doesn't have to physically go, yes, no, 33, 33, 33, and fill that gap where we're getting the benefit of the check without having to make a human being do it? And it's going to be a combination of things, right? It's going to be sensors, robots, drones, cameras, people. I want to get as much of the people part out of it and get as much of it automated as possible. That's the big gap.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you're doing at Ops Analytica and your insights into the data and reporting needs of multi-location businesses, regardless of industry. It's definitely a very interesting and important area of effort. So I appreciate all of the time and energy that you and your team are putting into that. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Oh, thank you so much, Tobias. Take care.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other shows, Podcast.init, which covers the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used, and the Machine Learning Podcast, which helps you go from idea to production with machine learning. Visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.